Welcome, everybody. We're just letting lots more people in, so we'll just start in just a moment. Okay, so let's kick off. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. I'm Karen Peachy, the Director of CaLP, and very pleased to welcome you to this webinar. Today we're tackling a hugely important issue, and we're doing so with simultaneous translation in Arabic, French and Spanish, a first for CaLP. If you would like to use the interpretation services and haven't already done so, please make sure you download the app via the instructions in the chat. We'll be using the hashtag protection amplified, so please use that if you're doing any social media action. Before we move on further, a few thank yous. First, thank you to all of you who have joined us today and to the hundreds of others who have registered with us to join via the live stream or receive the recording. Your presence shows us the need for this, the interest, and we believe it shows that if we pull together, we can address some of the issues being raised. I'd also like to thank all the panelists and ICT4D who have worked so closely with the CaLP team to develop this event. Our thanks also go to GFFO, USAID, and all the other donors that support our work. I'm sure you're all Zoom experts by now, but just a few quick reminders to help make the event work well. Okay, so the webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you're joining in discussions in the breakout groups. Do post your questions in the chat box, and we are recording this and it's streaming live and the recording will be shared. So why this event? First, let's think about a person in crisis. Let's start there and think about personal data as an extension of self. Data isn't just a digit on a phone or a word on a piece of paper. It is part of us. Second reason, we have moral, ethical, and legal responsibilities in this area. Third, this has been identified as a high priority by many practitioners. Indeed, data responsibility is one of the most significant risks identified in cash and voucher assistance, or CVA as we often refer to it, and has been identified by the Grand Bargain Cash and Risk Workstream and in State of the World's Cash report. In line with that, in the run-up to the webinar, we crowdsourced information to get a snapshot of how equipped your organizations were to manage the data. This isn't a comprehensive survey, of course, but findings from LinkedIn and Twitter users say for sure there's need for more action. And honestly, I think our experience also shows that we would probably put it as more urgent action than some have actually suggested. By coincidence, this event falls on the one-year anniversary of the declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic. While it wasn't intended, it's somewhat appropriate given the scale up of CVA and the accelerated use of digital platforms over the last year, both for CVA use and for other purposes driven by the pandemic. Everyone on this call has been impacted by COVID, so our sympathies go to those who have lost loved ones, or who have or are struggling in other ways as a result of the pandemic. Let's take a moment to reflect and think about the millions who have been impacted. Thank you. And now we move on with a quick overview of today's agenda. We have an exciting 90 minutes ahead of us. The objective of today's webinar is to get acquainted with the new guidance, dispel some myths around data responsibility, and discuss concrete approaches to responsible data management. Many of you have already shared questions and we'll be tackling them as we go, but do keep them coming in the chat. We have 8 wonderful speakers today. We'll start with Anissa, who's with Mercy Corps, and she's also a member of our CaLP board. She'll give us some opening reflections. Then in session 1, we have Stuart of the OCHA Humanitarian Data Centre, Linda, an independent consultant who really led the work on the development of the guidance and the case studies, and Joseph from IFRC, another data expert. And then in session 2, we have Ana Maria from the Ministry of Finance, the Republic of Colombia. We have Anna from NORCAP, formerly of CaLP, and also played a critical role in driving this work forward and developing the guidance. We have Han from Give Directly, playing a big role in the work on the second case study, and Wael of the Cash Consortium of Yemen. In all of these guidance notes, there's been so much consultation, and many of you on the call no doubt will have been involved in different ways. With that, I now pass over to Anissa. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Great, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Anissa Toscano, and I am Mercy Corps' Vice President for Humanitarian Leadership and Response, and as Karen said, also a CaLP board member. It's great to be here with you all today for such an important topic. As you all know, this conversation has really never been more important. As Karen mentioned, we mark 1 year today of WHO declaring the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're seeing humanitarian needs rising in a way that was really hard to imagine a year ago. You all know WFP is estimating over 270 million people are acutely food insecure. That's just one example, which so many of you know really well. And all of this is happening within rising complexity in so many of the places that you all work and live. At the same time, we're seeing increasing opportunities and growth in the ways in which we are seeking to meet some of those needs, and including through the rising proportion of cash being used in the humanitarian sector. I know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with CaLP's State of the World Cash Report last year, which told us that the total amount of CVA has doubled. We're now looking at somewhere close to 5.6 billion when we were in 2019. CVA has become an increasingly important tool in the humanitarian toolbox. And alongside this growth during COVID times, we've also seen an increased emphasis on social protection. To cite Ugo Gentilini, this growth amounts to more than 1,400 social protection measures, of which 1/3 took the form of cash transfers, reaching over 1.1 billion people. It's massive. So within these trends, it becomes absolutely critical to talk about data protection. So while this topic is cross-cutting, it's not unique to cash. When cash is digitized, when we move to digital payments, it contains so many of the data protection components that we're most concerned about. Core elements such as personally identifiable information, our core identity. As we've seen with some recent debates, this topic draws a host of diverse views, and it's demanding we look carefully at it. Those critical risks of exclusion, marginalization, direct harm, who generates data, who owns it, who stores it, who shares it, with whom, and who consents. Technical, ethical, legal, financial questions, countless. At the core of that data protection is protection, and we must prioritize it as such. It's our core accountability, right? To do no harm, to provide assistance with dignity and self-determination, and with equal dedication to treat people's data with respect, not to put people at risk through misuse of their data, and ideally to promote that same privacy and protection that anyone in the world should expect. So how do we approach this question as aid actors? Progressing this conversation involves promoting knowledge and approaches, as is happening in so many different corners of our sector. It requires honest, open conversations within and between teams, between organizations and actors operating in this space, as well as with the communities and individuals with whom we're working. And this is why this conversation today is so timely and more critical than ever. We have a crowd of participants today. It's rising with the minute. I don't know what we're at right now, but it's incredible. We've got incredible speakers that bring various perspectives from a range of vantage points, and we will have some in-depth discussions with all of you. So let's let the conversation begin. And just to close with a thank you from my side, both as Mercy Corps and as a CaLP supporter and board member. I'm really grateful for this conversation. With that, I will pass it over to Stuart for panel 1.
Thank you, Anissa, and thank you, Karen, and the entire CaLP team for having me and hosting this important conversation. As Anissa and Karen both mentioned, data responsibility is top of mind for humanitarians around the world. And what we'll look at today is how the CASH community has continued to lead in this space like it has in many others. You might be thinking, more guidance on data responsibility? The CASH community already has quite a lot of this, and that's true. But as we continue to see the complexity get more and more sort of related to how we do what we do on a day-to-day basis in humanitarian action, we have to be able to navigate the emerging challenges as well as the better understood ones. And that's where this first part of the panel comes in. We'll hear both from Joseph and Linda about the most recent guidance by CASH practitioners on data responsibility in this area, and give you a chance also to interact. So just a quick plug again to drop any questions you have into the chat as we go. We also will work on the questions that were submitted during registration to get to as many of them as we can. What we'll do to start is hear from Joseph about new guidance that was released in January by the IFRC that's specific to data protection. And so we'll focus there first and then zoom out to the broader data responsibility toolkit that was launched just 2 days ago. And we'll hear from Linda on that. So Joseph, first over to you to just tell us a bit, what specifically does this new guidance cover? How is it different? And how can people practically put it to use?
Great. Thank you so much, Stuart, and it's a pleasure joining this discussion, very important discussion today. So I'm with the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. I'm part of our global CASH team responsible for CASH innovations and information management. We support national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies in implementing cash and voucher assistance, or CVA, in disaster and crisis affected communities. We have seen cash implemented in more than 100 countries and regions by our local actors and international movement partners. As Stuart said, IFRC just released its practical guidance on CVA and data protection for CASH practitioners. It's a public document available in the CASH Hub for Red Cross Red Crescent movement, but it's also accessible to other organizations looking to refer to how other guidance could be translated. We see this as a complement to the CaLP's data responsibility toolkit, which you will hear about as well. Which covers a broader topic, range of topics than data protection. So this IFRC guidance is really honing into data protection specifically. As Stuart also mentioned, you might wonder, yes, there are other existing resources out there. The IFRC and the ICRC, for instance, have policies on data protection. There's also the Data Protection Handbook, where there is a specific chapter on cash. But what we have heard from our national societies is that these resources could sometimes be too high level, theoretical, or too legal focused to understand. So in our consultations, we've heard comments like, we are not legal experts. We need help to translate this into something more actionable. We need something more practical. So therefore, the methodology that we use in developing this guidance looked at the steps in the CASH program, which practitioners are already familiar with. And we called out the considerations and how to apply key data protection principles. It is not meant to scare or intimidate people about data protection. Rather, it helps in raising the awareness of data protection risks, so proper action and informed decisions could be taken. In our consultations, again, with national societies, we asked them if they have had beneficiaries raised issues about the data to their organizations, and the answer was it depended really on the situation or context. Those who were affected by sudden onset disasters, for example, are more concerned about their safety and security than they're likely to give as much information as you ask of them. So as you can see, there's a level of trust in humanitarian organizations, which could be quite fragile. So this is why awareness and education is important. So staff, volunteers, and other stakeholders, CASH stakeholders, are able to ensure their responsibilities in safeguarding beneficiary data, and that affected individuals as well are aware of their rights to their data. So we hope you would find this resource useful, and we also welcome your feedback to make it useful for others as well. Back to you, Stuart, or to Linda, actually.
Thanks, Joseph. Yeah, and right over to Linda. Feel free, Linda, of course, to speak to how the CaLP toolkit also addresses personal data protection issues, but we know that it's quite broad in scope and addresses some of the other more thorny and less obvious issues to navigate. So look forward to hearing from you how this also builds on past work from CaLP and its partners.
Sure, thanks, Stuart. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I think before I start, I have to give a huge shout out to the team at CaLP and to everyone who participated in key informant interviews from so many different organizations. We also had a really great advisory committee that really helped to kind of orient where the guidance should focus. So this guidance really builds on guidance that had been developed by CaLP about 5 years ago, which I know I used a lot in my work with other organizations. So what we did with this one is slightly different from the guidance Joseph is talking about. We came at it from the data life cycle. And so I guess I would say some of the three big questions that really came up during interviews and with the advisory committee were first these higher level issues of ethics, issues of power, context questions related to data. So the 2016 toolkit, which was the data starter kit that you might have seen before, put a lot of responsibility into the hands of implementers. And we've seen over the past 5 years that the amount of cash that's coming through now and the different types of partnerships that are coming up with CVA has really forced a lot of these decisions to be happening at higher levels, at headquarter levels. Sometimes they're made by large agencies who have more power in the response. And so implementers don't have as much influence over certain types of decisions that happen early on. So we wanted to provide some guidance to those who are making decisions, whether that's a business development team, whether it's higher ups in the organizations that are kind of making decisions around what types of programs they're going to get involved in. So we really brought in this idea of doing a political economy analysis, but focused on data. So we can start to look at some of those hidden power dynamics. They might not be hidden to most people, but they're not always talked about. So we recommended that, which is one change. We also had a ton of support from James Eaton Lee at Oxfam to really look into some of the legal questions around what are the right lawful bases to use when we're collecting data. Should we be going with consent, or should we be going with other potential lawful bases that might be relevant and might be areas that we could look into? So we delved quite a lot into lawful basis and some guidance on that. And then we also looked at how to address some of these issues with data ownership, because that question always comes up, and had some good advice as well from the team there on defining data controllers and data processors, and then kind of stemming out from there. Sometimes that really helps to define what the roles and responsibilities are, what the liabilities are, and helps us frame legal agreements that we need to have when we're entering into partnerships, whether that's with other agencies or whether that's with financial service providers. And then I guess the third area was really this aspect of data sharing. You're going to hear a little bit about the case study on data sharing with governments, but this is a huge issue in the cash community. The CVA community is around how do we share data? How long does it take to get data sharing agreements worked out? What should they contain? Lots of power dynamics around data sharing. So again, we come back to that kind of political economy of data and how data confers power. It's a contested space in some cases, and there's a lot more data sharing happening and needing to happen. So we delve in a little bit to the data sharing and draw from other types of guidance that's out, including the OCHA guidance that you know well, around how to set up some of those data sharing and data processing agreements. So I'd say those are some of the big areas that are different from the earlier guidance. But then we also go into a lot of the nitty gritty throughout the rest of the data life cycle around data collection, data transmission, data storage, and data retention. So I will stop there because I know there's a lot more to talk about.
Thanks so much, Linda. No, it's really exciting, and I've had the chance to go through the final toolkit and can vouch for its practical nature. Also, with the resource from IFRC, it's really complementary to what exists, and I think that's the key. What we've heard, including through the research that was featured in the latest State of the World's Cash report, is that a lot of practitioners have felt that there's a still quite large gap between guidance and practice. How do we bridge that gap between what we're writing and what we're doing, particularly for those of us that are thinking about and writing about these issues, but not necessarily grappling with them in practice every day. And these two new resources really help fill that gap in a lot of ways. So Joseph, one aspect that comes out for me quite strongly in the new IFRC guidance is some of the technical safeguards that you're recommending. Could you talk a bit more about those safeguards, particularly with an eye to organizations perhaps smaller than the movement or the UN or some of the larger INGOs, and the technical steps they can take to ensure data protection and cash and voucher assistance?
Great. Thanks, Stuart. It's a very important question, certainly. It's important to consider capacity and also the potential cost in implementing or embedding data protection in cash practice. I remember back in 2017 when the Data Protection Handbook first came out, I thought it was a very good resource, particularly that there was a chapter that was specific to cash, but it also left me this feeling of, wow, this is going to be a big undertaking. We will need, a data protection officer to help us implement this. We would need, new secured systems in place to be able to have a level of compliance or something. But reflecting more on now as we're providing support to local actors on the ground and in developing this data protection guidance with our legal colleagues, we thought about the minimum elements to ensure that even organizations with limited capacities are able to act and address data protection. We were not prescriptive on systems or tools or to say go digital or don't go digital. We know the realities of digital divide in certain contexts. Well, we were also cognizant that investments on robust tools really do help improve the agility and ability to address data protection issues. But aside from tools, there are examples of what could be addressed already by many organizations, regardless of size. One is investing time on risk management. For instance, conducting a data protection impact assessment or DPIA before starting a program and maintaining a risk register or risk matrix for your program, which includes the data protection risks. Once risks are identified, you can then analyze the likelihood and impact of these risks in your program, and you can work on the mitigation options. Options could include reaching out to donors or partners for help. So for instance, if the volume of your sensitive data is too high and you need secured systems, perhaps a partner might be able to support you on this. Or based on the risks, you might need to adjust your program design altogether. You might find out that it might be too risky to go with a financial service provider and therefore look at other payment mechanisms or modalities. Another thing that organizations can do now as well is to look at their processes and try to optimize them to include data protection. So one example that we have in the guidance is in beneficiary registration, for instance, where instead of going directly to communities with your standard forms and templates that you may have used before from your last cash program, have a moment to check if you absolutely need to collect all of those data using these standard templates. Ask yourself, if I don't collect this piece of data, will this impact how I provide cash assistance? There will be a change in the program objectives? Will there be commitments to donors that I cannot fulfill? So this is an exercise, a practical exercise to really thinking about data minimization, which is one of the principles that we have highlighted in the guidance. There are also ways in which organizations can work on preset agreements or having standard data protection clauses that might be available in several of these toolkits now to be able to prepare and be ready to negotiate, if they have to, with donors, governments, and financial service providers to really ensure that data protection is key in there. And then, of course, from a community perspective, you can work on your engagement and accountability strategies with communities by training staff and volunteers in how to communicate to communities how their data will be used, to whom their data will be shared with, and to understand what are their concerns with their data, and of course, their rights to their data. Lastly, if you are still unsure on how to apply data protection, ask for help. I think the cash community certainly has been growing and we're collectively gaining more experience. So in addition to these practical resources, for the Red Cross Red Crescent movement, for instance, we have a help desk hosted by the Cash Hub where national societies can send questions. But you could also consult with your peers and forums where it is safe to share these types of issues or concerns, because data protection could still be sometimes be seen as a sensitive topic. But there are working groups out there that you might be able to also leverage to have this conversation and be open about, some of the solutions that might be available.
That's excellent, Joseph. You've given people in the audience a nice list of things they can take away and do immediately, and probably are already doing in a lot of different contexts. So thank you so much for that. Linda, I want to pull on one point that you mentioned earlier, because it's particularly complicated in the context of cash, and that's around consent for the various potential reuses or future uses of data that might be collected at the initial point of registration or distribution. So how can cash practitioners think about this thorny issue, and how does the new guidance help them do that?
Sure, I think consent is something that we've been hearing about for a long time, and there seems to be always, every meeting that I go to about data, someone brings up consent, and then we all say, oh, but who's doing it well? No one's doing it well. What should we do? How can we ensure informed consent? And I think this question is just getting bigger and bigger as we really move to digital data. So what we've done in the guide is provided, as I said, more orientation on choosing a lawful basis for data processing. And so this is drawing from the GDPR, which is the EU's legislation that came out, but I think it provides some interesting options for addressing consent. So we talk about consent, and then we talk about legitimate interest and public interest. And so these are kind of three different lawful bases for collecting data that exist and that could be relevant in a cash and voucher situation, especially in a digital situation. So the issue with consent is that, as everyone knows, we're never sure if it's actually informed. We're never sure if people really understand. We're never sure if people feel that they have a real choice. And those are issues that have to be present for informed consent. And also, we don't often give people an option to not provide their data. And that is also an aspect of consent. There should be a choice. If I don't provide this particular data, I should still be able to access particular services and benefits, especially we're in a situation where there's such a huge power difference between those who are providing cash and those who are needing to receive cash or vouchers. So legitimate interest and public interest or public task really takes that burden from someone to provide consent where they might not completely understand what's going on, or they might feel obligated. It removes that obligation from the person to pretend that they really know what we're talking about, or pretend that they're actually fine with giving us their data. It puts the onus on an organization to ensure that the data that we're using is absolutely necessary, that it's proportionate, that we have a real legitimate reason to collect it, that it doesn't infringe on the rights of the person who's providing it. It requires this to also be transparent, in any case, but it puts the onus, or it puts the liability and the responsibility on the organization to make sure that harm is not done. So it's almost like you have to provide the same amount of information to people when you're collecting data, but when you use the legitimate interest as lawful basis, it really puts the responsibility on you to make sure that the data is not used in surprising ways or in harmful ways. And so that's something that's starting to be explored a little bit more in the humanitarian space, and we provide some more detailed guidance on that in the toolkit that hopefully will be useful for folks. I think we should have a much larger discussion on this in general going forward. So I hope this will kind of open up, along with some work that others have done in this space, more discussion on lawful basis.
Great. Linda and Joseph, thank you so much. This is a rapid succession webinar, so I unfortunately have to move us to the next part of the discussion, but thank you for highlighting just some of the key takeaways that people can gain from the two new pieces of guidance, and looking forward to connecting in the later part of the session on how we dig into these issues in more detail. With that, Anna, it's my pleasure to hand over to you to lead the next part of this discussion.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Linda and Joseph, for this excellent sneak peek into what the guidance holds. I'm really pleased to be able to start this segment of the of today's conversation, where we'll be taking a deeper dive into some of the real-life challenges faced by actors who work with data at scale in humanitarian and social assistance programs. So we're very lucky to be joined today by three excellent experts, practitioners, implementers, regulators. We have Ana Maria, Deputy Director Unit of Financial Regulation with the Ministry of Finance of Colombia. We have Han Sheng-Chia, Director, Special Projects at Give Directly, and Wael Darwish, Chief of Party, Cash Consortium, Yemen. And in this part of the conversation, or rather in the first part, and also both Linda, Joseph, and Stuart highlighted, we can anticipate this is mentioned front and center in the guidance, is that when attempting to work responsibly with data, there's no one size fits all. What works in one setting will be a big red flag in another. And even how we think about and define the context and who the key players are within it always influences and should always influence the design of the intervention. And in going about this this work, collaborating with Linda and others, we also heard from numerous colleagues how the whole subject of data responsibility requires practitioners to constantly walk this tightrope of staying ethical and principled in our actions, whilst maintaining legal compliance to laws and regulations in operational locations, while keeping the program operations running effectively, efficiently at scale. So how we ask in this segment, how true is it that what is legal isn't always ethical, and what's ethical isn't always practical when providing assistance at scale, fast, and when the primary objective is actually provision of assistance at scale, fast. And what are the solutions? Is it, as the recent ICRC blog suggested, is it that we need more regulation, or do we always need an effective plan B? So we're going to explore three very different contexts, hear about data ethics and responsibility dilemmas that this context present for practitioners, and also hear about approaches towards navigating these dilemmas that our experts are living through and exploring. Han, I'd like to turn to you first. So one of the case studies that was just published yesterday explores digital remote targeting approaches that Give Directly and others are using for cash assistance, some spurred by the pandemic, and also the unprecedented challenge that it brought of how to deliver CVA at huge scale, as quickly, inclusively, and accurately as possible to recipients' rapidly increasing caseloads. Can you talk about the context, background, and your organization's intuition behind the idea of using non-traditional methods for targeting? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That's a great question. As you say, context really is key. And the context that we're stepping into, right, as all of us know, is that the World Bank estimates that 150 million people could be thrust into extreme poverty because of COVID, the first increase in over 20 years. And because of this, Give Directly is responding with a range of different methods to pay about 500,000 individuals across 10 countries. These methods include topping up existing government social protection lists, working with community-based organizations, and the method that is described in this case study, which is partnering with telecommunications companies to reach some of their most vulnerable subscribers. So how exactly does this telco approach work? It's really a four-way partnership between Get Directly, UC Berkeley, an academic institution, the government of Togo, and the telecommunications companies in Togo, to address a very specific problem, which is in the absence of a robust national census or national social safety net list, how can we reach hundreds and thousands of the extreme poor in very remote settings? And so together with UC Berkeley, we have leveraged the latest in machine learning to predict poverty amongst cell phone users. And this is not dissimilar from what many of us on the call may be familiar with in the humanitarian sector, whether it's when we use the VNA, the vulnerability needs assessments, right? Or PMT, the proxy needs test, where an enumerator evaluates a household and says, okay, you know, the walls of this household are made of organic material or made of brick. How many children under 5 are there? And these are all, you know, these 10 or 50 questions that we ask are all predictors, right, of somebody's underlying state. In the same way, how a wealthy individual and a poorer individual use their phones, whether they buy more data, whether they make international calls, these are all very predictive of one's vulnerability. What's really exciting is that we've demonstrated this at scale and been able to pay more than 30,000 individuals living under $1.25, so very, very poor in weeks. Now that's the value piece, right? The big questions now are, can you design, could we design the data protection and management and governance systems in a way that achieves the value while protecting beneficiary data? Can we be compliant with the local laws? And can we achieve values that a number of us have touched on that are very important to us, such as inclusivity and community comprehension? Right, so I'm just going to tease that a little bit and just say that we've got some really exciting preliminary results that show that this approach was not only more accurate at identifying the extreme poor, but also at being more inclusive. So the results were 2.5 times more inclusive than the next best available policy option available to aid actors in Togo. And so we were able to empirically show that. So recap, we're facing a giant crisis. The approach is not dissimilar in prediction power from what we currently already use, although we are able to deliver it at much larger scale. And the question is, can you deliver the value, and how do you deliver the value while minimizing the risks? Thanks.
Thanks, Han. Okay, you don't ask small questions, certainly, so massive one. Wael, can I turn to you next? And it's well known that both humanitarian CVA and social protection are activities that require handling of huge quantities of personal and sensitive data. We also know that effective linkages between the two require clear data governance and data sharing arrangements, as Joseph just reminded us in the first part. But it's also, we also know that it's critical that agencies always keep the best interest of affected populations when making decisions about data sharing, which is the subject of the second case study. However, operating contexts are varied and often require CVA actors to use creative strategies to negotiate multiple challenges to help determine which decisions will lead to the greatest benefit and the least harm for people we're trying to serve. So what is unique about the context you work in, Yemen, as the lead of the CASH consortium from a data responsibility angle? Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for all the colleagues with their previous experiences and their studies being done. To take it a bit to our context in Yemen, before we are asking those big questions we're discussing here that are quite vital for us down the road, we need to take it a bit back to what data protection in Yemen actually means, honestly, Anna. From our side, data protection, or the information we all handle as INGOs, is quite a responsibility on us. because we work in a country where we have multiple governments, as you all might know, or multiple authorities on the ground. We have multiple authorities even on governorate and district level. And the information we handle or we gather on that specific level can actually be used in a positive aspect to deliver assistance, of course, but also if shared with the wrong, let me say, parties or not handled quite responsibly, can actually lead to some circumstances that are not very positive on the ground. From our specific experience in the Cash Consortium, we actually delved into how we can handle that specific example. How can we protect the data being gathered by our partners in the Cash Consortium as the CCY and as humanitarians at large? We looked at the targeting, we looked at how we store our beneficiary data, we looked at how our referrals are working between each organization. How can we protect that, I call it always, how we can protect that link, that circle of information to enable the delivery of the assistance to our beneficiaries the best way. In Yemen, it's quite hard. Let me be very honest with the guys. Like, it's great that we have quite advanced systems in place, but if we want to contextualize all the studies and all the systems in place to Yemen, it becomes quite an intensive issue. Because at the end of the day, the authorities in the different locations in Yemen, for example, Anna, will not allow us to operate if we do not share at least that data set. Knowing us as humanitarians, we all know that there's some red lines around what we are willing to share and we are not willing to share because of previous examples of how that data was used and also what we expect can be used. And that falls under one of our colleagues previously when he mentioned the risk register. When we need to work on the risks that can come out of that information being shared with the wrong parties or even leaked in a way or another with the wrong parties, what is the price of that information going down? From our side in the Cash Consortium, that put a couple of very interesting questions. One, what is the limit of information sharing we will go to versus the delivery of assistance as fast as possible in a country like Yemen, where 22 million people are in need, where it's a context that keeps evolving, we all know, and the people are always on the move. What are we willing to share? What are our red lines where we say this is the limit where afterwards we're not willing to share? And following, of course, that question is, where do we decide to say, okay, it goes this way or it doesn't go? And that's a big question specifically for Yemen team, where all of us as humanitarians had to come along and discuss this issue. It cannot be dealt as an organization or as a consortium or a specific agency. This had to be an approach across all of us together. So these are the questions from our side that we will be tackling and talking about like down in the column. To you.
Thanks, Wael. And thank you for highlighting the once again the that there is genuinely no one size fits all, and also the importance of actually knowing what your red lines are before you dive deep into some of these questions and dilemmas. But now let's look at our third context, and I'd like to turn to Ana Maria, and just to stress again that we're very lucky to be able to have a regulator's perspective in this important conversation. Especially we've seen in the past year in many responses to the pandemic how timely regulatory interventions have been able to facilitate payments and actually alleviate some of the suffering. So hugely important role. And Colombia in particular is a very interesting context, especially with recent announcements related to the implementation of the open banking framework and the promise, of course, that it holds for greater diversity and financial inclusion for end users. But we also know from some other contexts that have gone down that route that it does present a dilemma of how to balance transparency and inclusion benefits with potential data protection and privacy related risks. So could you share with us, Ana Maria, some of the background and key considerations of the Colombia's decision to move forward with this open banking framework? Thank you.
Sure, Anna, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to the whole organization. Well, I would like to begin with a little bit of the context as well, the context here in Colombia, since COVID-19 brought this digital uptake and it was a catalyst and a leapfrog in this whole consumer behavioral change and in financial inclusion, in particular in our country. We now face the challenge of perhaps consolidating these trends and manage amplified gaps, which we are also finding in all this pandemic, post-pandemic context. So I want to highlight the poverty effect. In the specific case of Colombia, preliminary analysis shows the poor population will increase around 6 points, leaving us with almost half of the population being poor. So by far, 2020 will be the worst year in history from a social mobility perspective in our country. And this brings us the new picture we have. It is precisely on the economic and social recovery agenda that we have the challenge to find a way in which data and digital financial inclusion can have a broader impact. So I believe this is a very timely panel. It is now the time for a dialogue about how data can best serve the interest of people and how we can really use it as a tool in the economic recovery agenda. From our standpoint as financial regulators, we see this whole data sharing ecosystem and data-driven world brings many opportunities to have a more efficient, a more competitive, and a more inclusive financial system, but it also brings challenges and very deep ones, since the velocity of the whole technological change accelerates every day, especially in emerging countries. So the financial industry is perhaps one of the industries which have seen this accelerated transformation. And as digital technologies spread, more and more people are creating this digital footprint, which at the end, financial services providers use that data trails to develop not just new products and services, but also ways to reach these new customers, especially those in the more poorer sectors of the economy to whom providing financial services becomes so costly, precisely because we don't have information about their behavior. So let me share with you the financial inclusion gap here in Colombia to give you a little bit of the challenge that we have. Around 46% of the adult population have an active account in our country, but only 12% of them make an online purchase or pay utility bills through electronic channels. And mostly 70% of the population do have a debit card, but most of the transactions performed with this type of instruments are mostly cash outs in an ATM. So at the end, we do have an economy that is heavily dependent in cash. And this is a big gap in financial inclusion remain in the country, especially for the low income segment. So in this context, sharing data through APIs with these third parties promise to be a solution to all of these difficulties. This is the concept that we know as open banking, and that was first introduced in Europe, in the UK a couple of years ago, and now it is spreading around the whole world. And it can be a valuable tool to encourage competition and innovation and promote better channels and services to benefit financial consumers. In Latin American region, Mexico and Brazil recently adopted a framework for this purpose. In the case of Colombia, we published last December a white paper to kick off our journey discussion with the industry and in the adoption of these open banking models. Our objective from the public policy perspective is to have a more efficient financial services industry, to foster competition, and especially to have a more financial inclusion sector, especially in the usage of financial services and the payments that you were highlighting, Anna, which we managed to have an improvement in that regard in the last year in the context of the COVID-19. We see a lot of challenges and a lot of risks in doing this adoption of open finance model. Protecting personal data is a big concern, probably is the best example of how to have this balance between opening the market and bringing new technology and innovation, but also keeping obviously the protection, adequate protection of the consumer, and it is data. So it is a priority, not only from the legal standpoint, but from the ethical angle. And the threats are not only from the cybersecurity risk or data frauds or scams that can be there, but also from the possibility that data usage ends not to serve the people needs, which is at the beginning, it is, as I highlighted, is the objective of this whole movement. So typically legal data protection approaches is heavily rely on the consumer consent model. Sometimes, however, what we are seeing is that, especially we are speaking about this vulnerable population, the model can be weak, it can be broken even. So all transitions toward digital economy, regulators and governments need to adopt these complementary policies and regulations to shift more responsibility on providers to safeguard consumers and build this trust around digital products. Moreover, all this digital context is also pushing policymakers to think on modernizing financial consumer protection, not just the data protection, but the whole financial consumer protection framework. It is no longer viable to rely just on adequate practices in having this disclosure about the cost or fees of the financial products. It seems that we now need to begin to think about guaranteeing access to the consumer data and empower those consumers to have possibility to move easily and quickly their data from one provider to another. So this is a big challenge, since this empowerment is not automatic. It needs specific capabilities on the consumer side, but also in the industry and authorities as well, to make sure that everyone is compliant with the new frameworks. So this is the, as I say, this is the challenge. We have building blocks, though. We have these legal frameworks, and we need to just step further, and on top of those, build this digital infrastructure, considering not only adequate financial regulation, but also data protection. I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ana Maria. And certainly it sounds like there are some important parallels and lessons from the sort of the first part of the conversation today, how the humanitarian sector is evolving its informed consent model to other models, with some of the proposals that you've just outlined, and thank you for sharing also the challenges. Now, I'd like to come back to Han now to talk a little bit about the sort of some of the solutions that you've found to know. I'm sure that there were quite a few sort of ethical dilemmas and challenges that needed to be navigated in the work that you talked about earlier, especially knowing that when the short and long-term benefits and harms have not yet been qualified or quantified because an approach is still in development or has not yet been evaluated. And there's little in terms of hard evidence to help with the ethical deliberations and decisions. So what were some of these dilemmas that KIP directly had to navigate, and how did you organize your thinking around them? What solutions have you been able to find? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anna. Maybe let me just start off by, again, recognizing the context. I think we're in a very different situation from what Wael was describing. We're not operating in a conflict zone. We're not operating in a non-governmental kind of a space operated by 15 different factions, right? And so for us, yes, it was a crisis, but we were operating with very cohesive, solid, high capacity bureaucracies, right? Whether it was UC Berkeley or whether it was the government or the telcos. So that allowed us really to establish really strong contractual and written agreements upfront. So that was in a very rapid period. So in about 2 or 3 months of negotiation, all of the structures were set in place for the next 18 months of programming, right? And so we're in a situation where we're very, in some senses, very blessed and very fortunate to have been able to demonstrate this. And I don't think we would have done it had these kind of high capacity bureaucracies not existed, right? And so we end up in a situation where, because the foundation was laid well up front, we're not having to each month go, oh my goodness, new crisis decision, new ethical decision, new trade-off to make, right? Which honestly has been something that I've been very grateful for. So very specifically, let me touch on one specific example of how setting all of this up front really works. There's this notion of trusteeship. Okay, so what is the most sensitive data that we're dealing with here? Right, it is the telco data, right? The call detail records that all telecommunications companies in the world have access to. In our four-way partnership, no one party has access to all of the data, and to the call detail records, only the telecommunications companies and our third-party trusted academic organization, UC Berkeley, has access to that data, right? So this notion of trusteeship, right? Who is able to access the data and make the analysis? Very limited. Data minimization, right, is a key policy and approach here, and minimizing to the trusted third party is a principle here. Another way in which it manifests is in the auditing of the of who gets paid, whether the rules were applied correctly, whether the algorithm was deployed correctly. Again, there's a third-party auditor in Ernst & Young that we have brought in that has access to data that not necessarily the government or Give Directly has access to, but that is able to come in and understand whether the eligibility rules have been applied systematically at every given payment. Right. And so again, this notion of trusteeship and an independent audit, in one case, trusteeship to an academic institution, UC Berkeley, and in another case, trusteeship to an external auditor. Right. And all of this, again, negotiated upfront, very systematic in the first 3 months at very high level, CEO, ministerial level, that allowed us to really set a strong foundation.
Thanks, Han. Great. Once again, the focus, thank you for emphasizing this need to, for upfront negotiations, sort of, and the thinking at the design stage. Keeping a focus on solutions, Wael, you've painted a really quite a vivid picture of the context, but share with us some of the solutions that you've been able to identify, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna, and thank you to Han again. Yeah, so taking it back to Yemen, it's a bit different from what my colleagues are talking about. So from our side, honestly, like I said previously, we all have to come together at this. The couple of solutions we actually came out with went around the following. First of all is going to how we can centralize all that data. The issue we had before is that data, as you might know, would be with illuminators, would be with all servers in different organizations, would be on different laptops, even on the field. In a context like Yemen, taking it back again there, where we know that staff are being stopped, everyone is being stopped, laptops are being confiscated, phones are being taken from, we had an issue with how data was moving around. So we went into centralizing all that data. And how I can say that, like, what we did is we blocked access to information based on actual roles within the organizations under the umbrella of the cash consortium. That wasn't meant just to hold power of data, because that also, people a lot talk about that component. It was meant to mitigate the risk from the field staff, from the partners on the ground, doing the actual hard work, doing that outreach, doing that registration, and simply they don't hold that information anymore. It was mitigated to the cash consortium IM team. At that stage, all of that information was designed in a way that wasn't in one physical spot on purpose. So that was a mitigation measure we took from the beginning. Also with the authorities, for example, to mitigate our partners' access, we were very honest on what our red lines are. There's a limit on what type of communications we can have, not out of disrespect to anyone, but because as a context of Yemen, again, specifically a context of Yemen, some sort of information we actually gather that will lead to the qualification of our beneficiaries to certain types of assistances can become a bit tricky by sharing broadly with the authorities. That was another conversation that took us multitude of months, to be honest. And like Han was saying, all that conversation was ahead of actually starting the new response. And we're very clear, if these red lines are not respected, if this conversation is not done at this stage, if we don't have an agreement now, we're not proceeding forward. And again, just to wrap up in a very fast way, for us, the power was all of us together, because in a country fragmented, like we mentioned, like Yemen, if we're not all within the same page, of course, we all have our own space, but we're working within the same red lines, within a boundary of what can we work or not, it would not have worked. This is how we worked around in a very brief way, Anna. And thank you to you again.
And thank you, Wael. Thank you, Wael, and thank you to all the experts who were with me in this part of the conversation. And it's a nice segue to the next section. Over to you, Lynn, I think.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lynn with CaLP. Thank you all for joining us today. And now we're going to be moving into breakout sessions so we can discuss and share amongst ourselves on how we take all this learning, all these resources, and all these experiences to see what we can do at each of our levels wherever we sit. So we have preset some breakout groups based on the information language preferences provided in the registration form. We know that's shifted. So we're shortly going to open all rooms. If you're in the wrong room, you can leave that one and you will come back to the main room, and you can tell us as the organizers which one you'd like to be in. And you can just put that in the chat. So you will be with some of our expert panelists and other CaLP colleagues here today. And we will get that started now. So Pauline, grateful if you can open up the breakout room. So please click the accept button, and we'll have about 20 minutes or so, and we'll keep a timer and remind the facilitators when you need to wrap up. Thank you, everyone. We are moving people over as quickly as we can. So please, if you do see a message, click on the breakout group, and you should have accepted a breakout session, but we're trying to move everyone as quickly as we can over. If there's anyone in this group who has not been assigned yet, can you please let us know if you meant to, or maybe you meant to not be in a group? Please let us know.
Hi, Lynn. I was just thrown out of group 2.
Oh dear.
Into group 6. Could you send me back, please?
Yes. So you are in 6?
No, I was in 2. I was in 2
Oh,
and I got put into 6, but I was quite enjoying 2.
Oh. And now I don't see you. Give me a minute.
I moved you back, Isabelle.
Oh, thanks, Pauline. Great. I see the room's been closed. Thank you, Pauline. And people should be trickling back into the main room in the next while. Welcome back, everybody, or some of you. I'm just waiting for everyone to trickle back in, and we will go ahead and wrap up. Excellent. I think we have the majority of people coming back in. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of time, not as much as we always would like to discuss and share and have more candid conversations. I did want to note, and I should have before, that the breakout rooms were not recorded. So I hope you felt that you could be as candid as you needed to be. Thank you very much. And I see some of the notes coming in from the groups have been really interesting. And I think one key takeaway from all of this and many of the discussions that we've had on this topic is that no one is really taking responsibility for data management because it's such a large and tricky issue. So we heard that from group 3. It involves so many different parts of the organizations, program, legal, ICT, and also the top leadership. And it really requires that to take it to the next level. We also did hear that in order to do that, there need to be more incentives. And I think since we have a good number of donors on the call today, it would be good also to be encouraging donors and partners to be discussing this more honestly about what's needed. And often it does take more resources. We do need the expertise, but we also know that there's a lot that that we can do at our individual level to make sure that we don't see data responsibility as this mysterious and uber technical issue, but we just think of it as this is how we need to provide humanitarian protection to the people that we aim to serve in this very digital age. So there's a need for not just the carrots, but also some sticks as well to improve the policy. We also did see that there was a commitment from one group too to undertake data protection assessments, so to better understand the wider ecosystem that we're all working in, which remains so tricky today. And there was a lot of other good thoughts, and as we go through compiling some of the recordings, we'll see how we can share some of these key issues going forward. And from CaLP side, we do want to continue to work and engage with all of you, our members, with private sector actors, with other data experts as well. So we hope that you continue to engage in these discussions through the D groups, through the CaLP discussion groups, etc. So just to wrap up, there's a lot of work that lies ahead, but we have, I think, a good basis, and hopefully you'll be hearing more from us. So I just wanted to thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you to all of our great speakers and expert facilitators, and all of you for taking the time in your very busy day to join today's discussion. And we hope you have a good rest of the day. We will be sharing the recording next week. Thank you.